talk to me about the three forces that you see that are influencing this moment. We've got banks collapsing, US dollars under attack, looming recession. What is going on? How do we step back and think about this moment?
I look at three major forces that are happening now, haven't happened in our lifetimes, but have happened many times in history. And those three major forces are the creation of a lot of debt and the printing of a lot of money to buy that debt, particularly because the government is running large deficits. And so they don't have enough money, so that government has to print that money. So that creation of all of that debt and its financial implications and its economic implications is one force. The second force is the internal conflict, the amount of conflict that's internally, largely due to the largest wealth gaps that we've had since the 30s. And that produces populism of the left and the right, particularly when there are financial difficulties. The third force is the rising power, challenging the existing power, largely in the form of China and to some extent Russia. So let's call it the great power conflict, because in 1945, there's this cycle. You have a war, then after a war, you have winners, and the winners determine the rules of the game. And then there's this evolution of others becoming more competitive, and then you have a conflict again for who's in control. So we have that dynamic taking place. So those three influences, the financial, the internal conflict, external conflict influences are having a dominant influence. I learned before that when I was surprised, often it was because of things that hadn't happened in my lifetime before, but happened in history because of that reason. I went back and studied history, the last 500 years, on these cycles. There are big cycles that last about 75 years, give or take about 50 years, and of rises and declines. And I put that out because I think it's so important people understand it. I put it out in a book called The Changing World Order and in a free video called The Changing World Order. So when we look at each one of those, they're important. I also learned in studying history that there were two other influences that were very big, and you could see them. The first was acts of nature, such as droughts, floods, and pandemics. The changes over time in the evolution over time of people's learning and the technologies they make. So I'd say there are the really five big influences that drive everything, and they are the money and debt, economic influence, the internal conflict, the external conflict, the nature influence, and the, let's call it the technology influence. So as we go now into this, it's important. Again, I put it out as a free video on YouTube so that people could see it easily. And when we get into whatever we're going to talk about, it'll be certainly in the context of those things. And since they each affect each other, it produces what I call the big cycle.
The animation that you put out in conjunction with your book, Principles for Dealing with a Changing World Order, have influenced my thinking around this moment more than anyone or anything else. It makes it seem so predictable from a historical perspective when you look at that big cycle and you see how it repeats. And so as you went through the last 500 years, one thing that you make very clear in the book is that the rise and fall of empires, the rise and fall of a reserve currency, they go in this 6-cycle trend. And the part that I always find unnerving is phase 6 is basically war and collapse. And so you have that previously dominant power loses its position, loses its status as a reserve currency, and it loses it for pretty predictable reasons in the three forces that you were talking about in the beginning, discounting the fourth force, which I don't think in every cycle you always had, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but you didn't always have a pandemic or anything like that. But the fact that we're living in a moment right now where we have all of them. And so we've got, not only is it a moment of massive technological disruption right now, good and bad, but we've got the money printing, the meme on the internet is money printer go burr. So we've got, printing because of COVID. We've got printing coming off of printing because of the 2008 collapse. And now we're again seeing this cycle repeat itself. So I've heard you say that that we're in somewhere in phase 5, which is as the empire begins to decline, as you have a rising superpower, as the debt bubble is getting out of control. With that perspective, was what happened with the SVB bank collapse, was that something that you knew, okay, something like that is coming, or was that a surprise to you?
No, it was obvious. Look, if you, just I want to talk about the mechanics, really. I'm so eager to pass along an understanding of the mechanics so people themselves can do the analysis. So one man's debts are another man's assets. Okay, so what happened? The government had to sell a lot of debt. And when it sold a lot of debt, there were a lot of entities that bought a lot of bonds, government bonds. And money was very easy, which meant that short-term interest rates were very low. And money was actually being given away because they had interest-only loans and interest rates were less than 1%, and you didn't have to pay back principal, so you could go get money. And so that created a lot of debt, and it created a lot of buying of government bonds. So what happened to Silicon Valley Bank is what happened to many entities all around the world, not just banks. They what does a bank do? A bank takes in deposits, typically, or debt in some way, and then it buys debt. It can do that in the form of making a loan, or it could do that in the form of buying a government bond, buying debt. And then when interest rates went up, the value of that debt went down. The money they had to give to depositors became more and more expensive. And also depositors, wanting them to be competitive, looked at money market rates or other rates and withdrew money from the bank because they had better uses. Okay, so what that leaves them with, it's a banking problem that has had thousands of years, that what they do is the depositors, want their money back, and they're holding assets that are, in this case, have gone down in value. So they're broke.
Let me put a fine point on that. Sorry, before you move on, I don't know that people really understand this. Is this a it seems to be a necessary result of fractional reserve banking, meaning that if you deposit $10 to me, I only need to keep, and I think this is actually accurate, I only need to keep $1. And so the other $9 I can actually put to work in terms of loans to other people or investments. And that puts us in a position where, okay, technically you're giving the bank a loan. A deposit isn't just, oh, my money is in a vault somewhere. I've given the bank a loan, and the bank is going to go do things with that of varying degrees of risk. In the case of SVB, they thought I'm doing the least risky thing, which is I'm buying government debt. The government is going to back it. The government, especially the US government, can actually print money if they had to cover that, which they did in this case. But if a lot of people go to the bank at the same time, known as a bank run, and say, I want all of my money, the bank goes, whoa, I don't have that money. And so I have all these assets. And as long as those assets remain liquid and I can liquidate them in a timely fashion, then sure, as long as the requests for people's deposits back are coming at a reasonable rate, all is well. But when you get a lot of people coming at once and you have the investments that they've made have gone down in value, now you get a perfect storm.
Exactly. I think you said it very well. You're allowed to be in the business. Let's call it 1/10. It's actually less than 1/10 is your money.
Whoa.
But let's call it 1/10. You have a certain amount of money up. They give you the deposits. You invest the money within these general guidelines. So, for example, government bonds are safe from default. So you buy the government bonds. You think you're making a spread.